Right, welcome back. You're still watching the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial, and we're counting down to 6 o'clock when we believe at the IEC Results Operations Centre in Pretoria, the final results will be announced and declared by the Electoral Commission. Right, now, smaller and political parties staged a protest inside the IEC's National Results Centre in Pretoria on Thursday night, raising a number of issues against the electoral body and with media coverage in general. Now, to talk to us and unpack this a little bit, I'm now joined by in studio by Sarah Findlay, who's Project Coordinator, Policy and Quality Unit at Media Monitoring Africa. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so us in the media, we're in it all the time, so it's sometimes difficult to judge ourselves, but part of the work that you do is to get an assessment of that coverage. Smaller parties said we didn't get enough airtime. That's why we were hit at the polls. What was your general observation about media coverage in these elections?
So we have released a report looking at March elections coverage and April elections coverage. And what we see, kind of as previous years, the top three parties, the ANC, DA and EFF, dominate, which is understandable because of representation in National Assembly and newsworthiness and all of those kinds of issues. And what's interesting is that the smaller parties didn't get a lot of coverage, but they got what we found when you think of having to divide by 48 parties contesting. How does the media, they find themselves in such a prickly issue, because how do you divide coverage amongst 48 across the country? And so those that have seats in Parliament we found were well represented and they got the coverage that they deserved. Smaller parties like the controversial BLF and even ATM as a new party got a lot more than what we would have expected, having only been launched a few months ago.
All right, so there might have been an unfair skew due to the controversial nature of some of these parties.
But I mean, that's to be expected. So even EFF, with Malema, with often headline-grabbing statements and often saying things in quite audacious terms, EFF got far more coverage than what the seats that they hold in Parliament. And so it's one of those, it's media's mandate to provide the coverage to those that need to be reported on.
So if you were our witness in court, would you say that the smaller parties were generally well represented for the size of the parties that they are?
Yes,
okay.
So that would be our kind of conclusion from this. We're releasing results looking at the full elections period at the end of May. But as it stands, we would say that those smaller parties, especially when they only have a constituency, when you look at the final numbers of 1,000 votes or 5,000 votes, what percentage of media coverage do they want? And I think that brings up the issue between equal coverage and equitable. And these are the editorial decisions that newsrooms have to make around what is in the public interest.
So I've looked at one of your reports, and one of the things that interested me a great deal is when you start looking at the voices that were coming through. So the political parties in general, perhaps fairly well represented, but we didn't do so well as the media, certainly in terms of getting an equitable sound in terms of voices. Tell us a little bit about what you saw there.
So political parties made up almost half of all the voices that we saw. And that's to be expected in an elections period, especially because our news is already so politicized generally. And so we expect that government voices, the presidency and political parties will make up the bulk. But what's really positive is for the first time in April, we've seen citizen voices getting up there and being the second highest voice. And the SABC, congratulations, is a key contributor to that, where they, as across all platforms, went over and above in terms of accessing citizen voices, which is a real positive step compared to previous elections.
All right. What about the male-female? Because sometimes a lot of these talking heads start to look the same, don't they? Certain type of man and not so often women.
And it's an ongoing challenge that the media sector face, where our results show that often over 85% of voices remain male compared to female voices. And that's a challenge both because there don't appear to be that many female representatives in political parties. When you look at your ballot, there are only a handful of leaders of those parties who are female, but also there are those patriarchal biases that continue across coverage throughout the years.
Yeah. All right. So when you look at the media, what could we have done better doing?
I think one of the key things is around increasing citizen voices again. Yeah. So even though I say that they were the second most accessed group, they're still only 9%, where political voices make up often 60%. And so it's getting people's views and digging in deep, hearing their stories. Where were you 25 years ago? What were some of your concerns? How have you decided who to vote for? Those kinds of things. We want a citizen's agenda when it comes to elections.
Is there any way that you can gauge the public's view and what they want? Because we're busy having a conversation now on what we think ought to be. Have you been able to get a sense in any way of what the public have been saying and wanting?
So I think a key issue over the last few years has been about media credibility and trust, and how they're decreasing levels of trust with the very people that the media are trying to access. And our big recommendation remains around getting citizens and getting voters' voices and stories out there. Once you connect and once you hear a story that affects you and is something that you can relate to, you'll want to consume more of that media. You want to hear more of those stories. You might even invest in a newspaper once in a while. And so one of the big stepping stones is around bringing it back down to people's stories on the ground.
So when we compare different types of media, we've got press, we've got digital, online, and then we've also got broadcast, radio and television. When you sort of breaking it down in those different areas, did the performances change, or were they fairly similar across the board in terms of how we covered the election?
So I think by and large, television and radio were quite similar. Online, there were just a sheer volume, there were greater magnitude of stories, which is a good and a bad thing. I think in some cases in the digital media, we try to rush and push out as many stories, but it lacks the depth, which we find in the television programs and the radio broadcasts, that you accessing more sources, and so there's a bit more depth, there's a bit more nuance to the quality of media that we're hearing. And so I think those would be some of the key things, is around volume on the one hand, which is positive, but sometimes lacking that insight and analysis that people often crave when it comes to an election.
All right, so at the beginning of the conversation we talked about the voices, citizen voices coming through political parties. What about content? Because in many ways people need to hear the content to be able to make a decision about who to vote for. How did the media do in terms of the kind of content that we released to the media, to the public?
So once again, very politicized. So half of the stories were directly political party campaigning stories, which I think is often quite tiresome. So on the one hand, you get to hear manifesto analyses, or you get to hear key campaign issues directly from the horse's mouth. But in other ways, it sometimes just feels like we're just being used, Here's another leader who's come to somebody, they've come to a school, and look at how much they're reaching out. And I think, people get a bit tired of that over and over again. And so that, I think, is one area that we can definitely improve on as the industry, is to move away from that events-based reporting and really dig deep into the issues and critique politicians and their manifestos on strategic issues as we go through, instead of just being led along a campaign trail.
All right, so analysis, I guess. What does this mean? But we did start to hear things like fact-checking. The minister said this, but this is actually true. And I suppose these are the kinds of reportage that the constituencies need to hear.
And bringing up fact-checking, one of the real shining moments for the IEC in this election was around the development of a disinformation platform where citizens could submit complaints around content that they found online that they thought was disinformation. And the IEC then took that on and evaluated it. And so that was a key mechanism to ensure that the flow of information that the electorate receive is accurate. And that's a key element of a free and fair election.
Did you track social media in any way? Because some of the journalism now is happening in that platform, and it's in and amongst a lot of other things. And I just wonder how it played out in terms of influence, cross-influence, good, bad. I don't know. What were your thoughts, if you looked at it at all, or you just stuck to the mainstream media?
So we did. We looked at social media, and we did a very brief analysis looking at the hashtags vote ANC, vote DA, and vote EFF. And what was immediately clear was just the sheer volume of tweets around them. So one would expect that the EFF would have the highest number of tweets, but it was actually the ANC. So over a 3-day period, they pumped out over 17,000 positive tweets around the ANC. The DA was less than 2,000, and the EFF sat at around 7,000, but in a specific 3-day period. But even that is very interesting when you think of the constituency of each of the parties. You would think that the EFF would have, by and large, the biggest share of that kind of social media coverage.
This is social media that they push out themselves as political parties?
No.
That's just people.
That's anyone, so including leaders, including the party, the official parties, but also just members but they were all positive in terms of vote ANC, DA and EFF.
Fascinating. Sarah, thanks very much indeed for unpacking a lot of these issues, and I'd like to think that we learn our lessons and help our citizens going forward. Thanks so much indeed for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. All right, okay, so what we're going to do is going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back at the top of the hour, and we literally are starting to count down because we're just over 60 minutes away from an important announcement at the IEC at the Results Operations Centre in Pretoria, and SABC News will be there to bring you all of that live. Stay with us.